guest tonight, as you know, is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who's the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, an American think tank built on the premise of advocating for the principles of the U.S. Constitution, liberty, and freedom through the separation of mosque and state. Remember that famous letter from Jefferson, the separation? Oh, that was church and state. Okay. So Zuhdi is promoting the separation of mosque and state, which is very Jeffersonian. He is a devout Muslim. He served recently as a commissioner on the congressionally appointed U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's an ardent activist for universal human rights and against the global movement of political Islam or Islamism. He has appeared many times to testify before various committees in Congress, and he's spoken very forcefully and very courageously, and for so doing, he has also taken the heat from some Islamist organizations who don't understand the distinctions that he espouses. Dr. Jasser is a former lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy who served 11 years as a medical officer, including a tour as staff internist to the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Supreme Court. Sometimes I wish he had done his job less well than he did. Currently, he is serving as a well-respected internist and nuclear cardiologist in Phoenix, Arizona. Dr. Jasser is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim's patriot's fight to save his faith. We have copies of the book for sale out there. We have replaced the microscopic yellow Post-it note that said $20, so now you can be seen in a larger envelope. And Dr. Jasser will be available to sign these books after his lecture, which is on the subject of fighting for victory against Islamism, a Muslim blueprint for the West. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jasser.
Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here at the Westminster Institute. And I have to open by saying, many years ago I read the Closing of the Muslim Mind, and I recommend it to a lot of the Muslims in our Liberty Project. And I'm here to tell you that hopefully my mind is open and not closed. And that's really what the challenge is I do believe Bob was right, that the Muslim mind has closed, for the most part at least, the folks running our faith and running our communities. And the challenge is really to open those minds. We always struggle with where we are and how to contextualize the subject matter, if you will, and it almost seems like every one of my talks opens with some type of apology for the recent attack that happened, be it Orlando, all the way back to Fort Hood, and now 15 years ago, 9/11. And the 15th anniversary of 9/11 is only a few days away. And I'm sure every one of you can remember where you were as those 4 planes attacked the United States. And one was not too far from here at the Pentagon. And at that time, and that's what my book opens with, it opens with me talking about how angry I was and how I almost wanted to re-enlist and get those bastards. And now you look where we are today, you realize that Al-Qaeda was an extremely small problem compared to the problem that we had. And for those of us that formed the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, nobody understood why our mission statement was to preserve the U.S. Constitution and freedom and liberty through the separation of mosque and state. They're like, wait a minute, the problem is terrorism. That doesn't make sense. Come along 12 years later, ISIS starts forming in Syria, and all of a sudden this terror group called the Islamic State forms, and people start to understand, oh, there's an Islamic State terror group. And I'm still 15 years later trying to explain to people that ISIS is even but a small symptom of a bigger global cancer that a quarter of the world's population has within it. So when we look at this problem 15 years after 9/11 and hundreds of thousands of troops that have deployed into the Middle East since then, and we can talk about for good or whether we made things better. I think we did. I think Iraq would be Syria today had we not happened to have gone in there and gotten rid of Saddam. As a Syrian, I can tell you that the Ba'ath regime of Iraq was not much different. It was just a different mafia family running a much larger country. And I think if you think the Syrian civil war was bad, Iraq would have been much worse. As chaotic as it looks today, the Arab Spring did not go through Iraq because the dictatorship had been removed by our sons and daughters from the United States. But I do believe that what I want to do today, and I know next week you might hear a little bit about diagnosis, as a physician, my book, as much as I read books like Bob's and I say, wow, there's a lot of scholarship in these books. And, there is a lot to be said about the deep academia and intellectual rigor of true deep reform intellectually in Islam that needs to happen in schools of thought and Sharia and other things. But I have to tell you, that is going to take generations. But what can happen in this generation is the defeat, militarily, but also mostly intellectually, of political Islamist movements. And if you think the Cold War was a major threat, that pales in comparison to the constituency that, for all the threat that the Cold War was, the communists only had a small percent of the Russian population, and ultimately that imploded from within without us ever directly going to war with the Soviets. Islamism, which is the problem, which is political Islam, but I actually, as much as Islamism is probably the best word to define it, what I define as the real problem is Islamo-nationalism, which is the marriage of Islamic identity with national identity. Because right now, what ISIS is finally starting to educate America about is that the reason ISIS is spreading a lot faster than Al-Qaeda. Remember, Al-Qaeda's mission, for all the world, as much as bin Laden was a caliphist, if you will, who believed in a caliphate, for all the world, their mission was really just to get the United States out of the Middle East. That was sort of their mission. They didn't really have this mission of establishing Islamic states, even though they believed in that, and they believed in a caliphate. Really, it was more of an anti-Saudi regime, anti-Western. That's why they committed acts like the USS Cole bombing, and then Al-Qaeda was to get us and our relationship out so that the royal family in Saudi Arabia could be displaced by an Islamist radical group like Al-Qaeda. But then come the Arab awakening. For the most part, the Arab awakening was, I believe, more of an economic revolution for free markets, for more autonomy and liberation. And then this, because as many of us who are secularists know and believe, and I say secularist with caution and tell you that I'm a devout Muslim, I believe in my faith, but I believe government should be secular, based in reason, not based in theocracy. But the secularists inherently are disorganized. So unroof a government from the Middle East, take away the dictatorship, and the secularists divided, as you all saw in the Arab awakening, be it in Tunisia, Egypt, or elsewhere, into hundreds of different parties and groups. So the Islamists inherently are united, and usually divided into just two groups, the Salafi fundamentalists and then the Islamists, the more core political Islamists. And really the only difference between the Salafists, the more right-wing, if you will, of the fundamentalists, they all believe in the Islamo-national state concept. The best definition I heard was from a Brotherhood member that, when I was on the Commission on Religious Freedom, we went to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and a number of countries. When we were in Egypt, somebody defined it to me the best. They said, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamist parties, use religion to get political control. The Salafis use politics to get religious control. But at the end of the day, they're doing the same thing, which is they're drinking from the same trough of Islamo-nationalism. They want the state to have an Islamic identity. So over the next 35 minutes, what I want to do with you is give you three things that I'd like you to leave here with as we look at solutions. 15 years after 9/11, And we are still not even into the diagnosis stage of America understanding where we are. So imagine the Cold War after World War II. 15 years later, we were into the Kennedy administration, and we were beginning to understand what the Cold War was. Now we have a much bigger threat with 56 countries that belong to this cartel of Islamist theocracies. Some are not obviously technically theocracies, but for the most part, they're all Sharia states. And 15 years later, we still can't even say radical Islam. And the reason the terminology is important is not because it's a talking point, but because you can't treat a disease that you can't define. Now, certainly, if you overshoot and say, well, all of Islam, then you're alienating a quarter of the world's population. But if you don't recognize that the Islamic community, the Islamic faith, has an inherent theocratic cancer within it, then you're going to completely miss the problem and end up with this whack-a-mole problem where right now domestically our whack-a-mole problem is we go from one incident to the next where our largest Homeland Security agency is sort of like this Minority Report program where they're trying to figure out where the next act of violence is going to happen, like that old movie. And that's impossible because some of these guys, other than posting a few things on the internet, usually won't have any records until they finally decide they think they're going to go to heaven and do their jihad and do their act of violence. But that's it. It's a whack-a-mole program from the individual. Then globally, we have this movement whack-a-mole where we say, oh, Al-Qaeda's the problem. And then we have a mission accomplished sign, and we go up and we say that Al-Qaeda's done. And in 2007, 2008, President Bush was basically right. Al-Qaeda had pretty much been decimated. But we hadn't had a solution. We didn't figure out what we were going to do once we got in there and we decimated the radical militant entity that had used Islamism to come into power violently, because the underbelly of that is huge, large political movements that, as we've seen in the Arab awakening, can get 30-40% of the vote. Now, you may see that as a major problem. I see it as an opportunity. When they get 30-40% of the vote, it means 60% of the people don't want the Islamists. The problem is we have to get those 60% to work together rather than as 40 different parties that are not Islamists. So how do we turn our global foreign policy, which is a whack-a-mole that goes from Jamaat Islamiyya in Pakistan to the Jamaat Islamiyya in Egypt to the Muslim Brotherhood to Hamas to Al-Qaeda to the Khomeinis in Iran to their movements? How do we do that? I think Secretary Rice had it right in Egypt in 2005, where she said for too long our country has exchanged stability for security, and we've gotten neither. And she's right. For too long, our paradigm in the 20th century was that we are just going to work with the dictators that have common enemies with us and keep them stable because they'll keep these countries at bay and they won't threaten us. And I'll tell you, even families like mine didn't mind that when we had a common enemy with the Soviets. But then the Cold War ends. I mean, listen, one of the reasons my family is as patriotic as we are, and my parents felt American the moment they escaped Syria as political refugees in 1967, was because of how anti-Soviet they were growing up in Syria. The population mechanisms of genocidal operations that you're seeing Assad use today are Soviet methods of controlling populations. And my father was put under house arrest at 16 years old simply for asking the question to his school teacher, as the Jeeps weren't working. He asked the question, he said, I heard the American Jeeps work pretty well in the winter. And next thing he knew, he was under house arrest for 2 weeks. So we understood that the world at the time was divided by two superpowers, and at times America is going to just work with the dictators and monarchs that it knew. And my grandfather ended up dying here in America, came to America and had abandoned his Syrian nationalism and said, I don't know if it's mentioned or who said it, but somebody said, every people deserve the government it has. And he said, the Syrians deserve this dictatorship. They're not rising up, they're not having a revolution. And I have to tell you, I wish my father and grandfather were alive today, because they'd realize, as much as right now you see the death and destruction of over 500,000, 10 million displaced, most Syrians I talk to still say it's worth it because they're alive. Syria was a prison for 60 years, a complete prison, just like North Korea. They had great buildings that were growing, and maybe music and things like that, but to say that the Assad regime was somehow a place, yes, they look back and say, gosh, is this worth it? And they never thought they'd be abandoned by the West, and we can talk about Syria in the Q&A, but again, I still think Syria is a symptom to the deeper problem. The secularists, some of us worked in a democracy coalition. I talk about that in my book, which was published in 2012. And we had at that time been hopeful that the secular liberals, which then became the Free Syria Army, which now are dominated by Islamists. Why? Because the Saudis and the Qataris and the Turks basically were the only ones funding the rebellion. But at the end of the day, that was the initial intent, was to fight the Assad regime before the Islamists also hijacked that revolution, as they did in every other one. But the cauldron that brewed that, as back to Condoleezza Rice's statement, for too long, stability was a mirage. These countries are not stable. Just because there's no kinetic war in Yemen right now or in other Muslim majority countries does not mean they're stable. Because the dictatorships use Sharia as the opium of the masses. And what that does is it gives us the illusion that somehow they're stable because there's no civil war, and yet they're infusing an ideology that is supremacist. And then, just as the Saudi royal family will, they'll step back and say, well, if you look, for example, at Twitter activity in Saudi Arabia right now, 80 to 90% of social media activity is Salafi Wahhabi, Salafi jihadi activity. So the Saudis get that data and they say, look, if we let the Arab awakening come through, our country will be overrun by Wahhabis and they won't be friendly to America. You need us, the royal family, to help you. Meanwhile, refugees are coming into Europe. They don't want them into Saudi Arabia. They say, we'll help you build 2,000 mosques and Islamic schools to help indoctrinate them into spreading da'wah and Islamism into the West. So this is no different than the Soviet imperial hegemony ideology, which is that they will export while they continue to maintain internal dominance of their ideas in their politburos. So at the end of the day, we have to somehow look at the long game. As long as we continue on the short game, we are going to lose, because these countries will continue to crop up illusions of new problems that we then send and say, oh, we're going to get a military to decimate ISIS and then the problem will be over. It's the same thing as the alcoholic that we think that somehow the drunk driver is the problem when it's the alcoholism. Give you another medical analogy. It's like if I treated lung cancer and said, oh, I'm just going to suppress the cough and treat my patient's symptoms and not treat the cancer. So the three things that I want you to leave with here. One is understanding where Islam is in its history. Second is we've whittled down to, when I talk to groups, the key is free speech. We can sit and argue all you want, and I'd be happy to talk to you about, the last chapter of my book is about how to reinterpret Quranic passages, how I was raised to believe both in the authenticity of the Arabic script of the Quran, but also to say, well, okay, here it says, cut the hands of those who steal, and yet that's barbaric. So what do you do? So there are ways to take literal script interpretations and modernize it and say, well, it says sever, which could mean sever a relationship, which could mean put somebody in prison versus actually cutting their hand. So there are modern ways to interpret it, but we can talk about that. But at the end of the day, they can't even have these conversations in our so-called ally countries, because by suppressing the open thought, by suppressing open debate and discussion, they prevent the very tool to modernize the religion that is stuck in the 12th and 13th century. And that's by design. Because then, just as Assad, if you look at the bombing operations that he's running, the bombing operations against ISIS are not in neighborhoods where ISIS is. They're bombing our families in Aleppo and the moderate, the bigger threat, because the secular liberals, the moderates, if you will, and however you want to define that, but bottom line is nonviolent, secular liberals who don't believe in Islamic states, and also are not secular fascists like the Baathists. Those are the ones that they're bombing, with some occasional few operations in Northeast where the ISIS guys really are. But their mission is not to put an end completely to the radical groups, because it serves a tool, just as the Wahhabis serve a tool in Saudi Arabia, and it's no surprise that the royal family has handed the judiciary and the educational and literature system in Saudi Arabia to the Wahhabis, while the royal family maintains the military and the government. That's an arrangement they got since '79 when the mosque was taken over, but at the end of the day, it's a mutually symbiotic parasitism, if you will, between two fascist movements, if you will. But there has to be a third path, and the way to get that is free speech. So where Islam is in its history, the utility of free speech to let that quarter of the world's population have that debate that we need to have. And last is reform, the R word, as I call it, because it's amazing that in many of the mosques across the country, reform is just an anathema. They look upon it like you're somehow changing the religion or pretending to be God, when in fact, all we're doing is taking a faith that we love, giving it tough love, and saying these are the ideas that need to be changed and modernized. So in those three things, first of all, I want to start with sort of the concept, if you will, of free speech. And you know that the terror attacks are coming closer. The most amazing one, I think, that really brings home the point is the one in Paris and then Belgium. The reason that's impressive, and for all of you who are heaped in studying this, you had the same terror cell commit 2 acts of terror 4 months apart. So that tells you that you have a major problem not only with the terror groups themselves forming, but with communities that are shielding and hiding these groups. So therefore you have circles of containment, of shielding the actual threat that are related to an allegiance, an insurgency. And as some of the groups, Quilliam Foundation that we work with in London calls it the Salafi jihadism stupid, say, hey, it's the Salafi jihadism stupid. That's what it is. Because the Salafi jihadi mentality is that these guys are martyrs, that they are working against the secular West, the enemies of Islam. So at the end of the day, the reason free speech is so important is these things are all tied together, and let me put them together for you in just as succinct as I can. The oxygen for all of this is the Islamic State, and the reason it's the Islamic State concept is, think about it. I served in the US Navy. Once I applied to serve, I committed to 8 years. If halfway through that I change my mind, you can't do that. All of you have served, you sign a contract, you can't leave. Why is that? Why does a free country like America prevent our soldiers from leaving if you agreed to serve 4 or 8 years? You can't leave at year 2. It's because of unit cohesion, it's because of commitment, it's because of many things. So our Constitution, similarly, we swear to uphold and defend the U.S. Constitution of the United States from enemies, domestic or foreign. And if you work against that, it's sedition. If you do so violently, it's against the law. Similarly, if you have an Islamic state and the Constitution is the Quran, if you leave that faith, it's as if you've left its military, it's as if you've left its constitution. So therefore, apostasy is punishable by death. Blasphemy becomes sedition. So jihad, I felt growing up in Wisconsin that my obligation to the United States was to serve in the military. At first I was going to go to one of the academies, but because I loved being a physician so much, I decided to go to medical school first and then serve. But there was nothing that was going to stop me if I got accepted from joining the US military, because I learned from my family that you have to decide what it is in your life that you are willing to die for, or that you would die for. That's what ISIS understands that we have yet to figure out as a country. Our sons and daughters get it when they sign up for the military, but we have not yet had Muslims accountable to what they would die for. Because right now you can work on being anti-terrorism, but once you decide you're against the tactic of terror, okay, you defeat the tactic, but then you're left with this vacuum. The mechanism, the tactic of achieving their ends might be defeated for a short time, but then you've left this vacuum. What are they for? You might be against terrorism, and right now our entire apparatus is CVE, countering violent extremism. That is the biggest loss of money and taxes and resources that I could ever think of. because you're countering a tactic that we can't even name. And it's called violent extremism, which everything is really violent extremism, and yet that is the focus because we can't identify Islamism or Shariaism, really, Islamic Statism, as the problem. So therefore, when they're signing up online and working to sympathize with Islamic State movements, not just ISIS, but any Islamic State movement or Sharia adherents, we can't follow that. And yet, that should be part of security clearances. It should be part of vetting refugees, immigrants. All these things should be part of that. And yet, we can probably count on one hand, and if we identified them, they wouldn't be working next week. The people that are experts in Sharia in Washington that are actually working for the government versus think tanks like this. So ultimately, a blueprint for victory, I think, is to begin to look at what Muslims groups that we can work with and individuals that would be willing to not only internally tell you behind the scenes what they would die for, but publicly say that it's not only the American flag, but liberty and freedom and a secular governance that believes that every individual is equal before the law and has a right to be president, and that the legal system doesn't inspire its understanding from a cleric or an imam that tells you what the scripture says. But you can have a debate, whether it be pro-life or pro-choice, but then base it on reason, not based on scriptural exegesis. This is really, that sounds esoteric to most, but at the end of the day, that is the only way to defeat this vacuum of anti-terrorism, that you can defeat the tactic, but at the end of the day, until Muslims are ready to die for a country that is based in secular law, based in reason, versus based in Islamic State concepts or Sharia, it's not going to work. And yet you have people like Shadi Hamid, who now is working at Brookings, wrote a book called Islamic Exceptionalism. And to me, this is actually much more dangerous work, because what it's doing is putting a veneer of moderation on political Islam. Basically saying that, well, the Islamists that we can work with that are Democrats with a small d that believe in politics and elections. And I think the Egyptians proved that, they proved two things. One is the negative, which is that elections are not the solution. The purple finger is not the solution for Iraq. It was the tribalism that was the problem, and majoritocracy that was the problem. Or mobocracy is really what elections became. But Egyptians also proved that 1.5 years of the Muslim Brotherhood running the government in Egypt did 1,000,000 times more to destroy the ideas of political Islam than 60 years of Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak. Now, I know that's a tough pill to swallow because it's a lot more unstable. Same thing in Iran. The Khomeinists, if we are able to actually effectuate a policy of regime change, where we work with the Green Revolution and work with secularists there, the Khomeinists will never see the light of day again in any fair election. Because the Iranian population, you know that Iran has the largest atheism conversion rate in the world to atheism. And I talk to many devout Muslims there that say, you know, the Khomeinists, the theocrats are killing our religion. And I'll tell you, as a Muslim, this is why I do this. This is why I, as a little doc from Phoenix, Arizona, take the time to do this, is because, first, it's because the West is going to be collateral damage to political Islam. Our security is, and I don't do this for my faith. I don't believe in clergy. I think imams are just teachers. We're a very decentralized faith. But I do believe that, one, national security will not survive a caliphate or some unification of the Islamic world that might happen if we don't help take sides within the House of Islam. And secondly, I do want my kids and my grandkids to love their faith and have a good relationship with God. And if Islam and the Quran is going to be that vehicle, I've got to figure out a way to give them interpretations of that are compatible with liberty and freedom. So the blueprint is for all of you as you leave here to start to take sides within the Muslim community. Stop treating us as a monolith, as that little 1% minority in America. You know, it's not going to make that big a difference, contrary to the Islamists who think that they can, you know, be that key vote in an election. The bottom line is that we need to be treated as a heterogeneous, diverse community with various ideas, from the Ahmadiyya to the Ismaili to the Shia to the Sunni. That's sects. And then within those, So diversity, when you talk about diversity within Islam, and this is why free speech to me is such an important thing, it's not just diversity of sex, it's within the Sunni community, for example. We need to understand, and this is something I worked on very passionately on the Commission on Religious Freedom, is we always talk about minority rights in Syria or in Saudi Arabia. What are the rights in Iran for the Baha'is? Absolutely, that is one barometer of religious freedom. But the bigger barometer, I think, is what are the rights for the Shia dissidents in Iran? Those are the guys, for the most part, lining the prisons in Iran. What are the rights for the Sunni dissidents in Saudi Arabia? Or the Sunni dissidents in Egypt? Because these dictators have, first and foremost, they put in prison the majority agitators in their countries, because that would be the way they would see the exit, is if the majority actually started to have diverse ideas. And America is no different. Muslims in America can talk to you all they want about all the different races in their mosques and the diversity of ethnicity, etc. There is very little debate or diversity of opinions in Muslim leadership in America. Very little. And one of the solutions that we talk about in our blueprint for victory is our Muslim Reform Movement. Our Muslim Reform Movement is basically groups like mine and at the American Islamic Forum that formed in the belief that the bigger problem is the Islamic State and the Sharia, the concept of Sharia adherence from a theocratic perspective. And we formed this coalition that 6 of us formed thanks to Sue Myrick back in 2007 when we started to look at counterterrorism groups and the minority voices. And we worked with some of the other institutes in town, including Hudson and Heritage and others, and started to get some of these quieter voices, well, not quieter, but less heard, more marginalized voices in the Muslim community together. And we formed a American Islamic Leadership Coalition. That then grew from 6 people to 6 organizations in the US, Canada, and Europe to 12. And then last December, 2015, our organization convened the first summit of anti-Islamist Muslims in the West. And there were 15 organizations that met. It happened to happen on December 3rd, which was, I think, the day of the San Bernardino attacks. So we thought we'd have a lot of attention. We had a 3-day summit that then concluded with actually the group that I had called the Anti-Islamist Muslim Coalition decided to call itself the Muslim Reform Movement, and we came up with a 2-page declaration. 2 simple pages. And after we met, there were 2 imams there and a number of us that have been working in this area for a number of years. And we decided, you know what? We can say that we're against this group, against the Muslim Brotherhood, against Hamas, against radicalism and terrorism, but we want to tell people what we're for. And we want you to have a tool that you can use and that government can use to say, well, this is the goalpost. This is where the end of where the end zone should be as far as trying to determine which Muslims are with us and which ones are against us. So instead of this paradigm that we use domestically and globally, which is, well, if we have a common enemy, then they must be our friends. Please stop that. The common enemy stuff is just, imagine if our FBI or our security apparatus domestically decided, well, when they're going to work against some gang, they work with the other gang in the inner city to work against that other gang. That'd be nonsense. We don't do that. And yet that's what we're doing when we side with Saudi Arabia against ISIS or with the Erdogan's Turkey with common enemies, etc. Even though they're a NATO ally, the bottom line is it's a Sharia evolving Islamist state. So at the end of the day, it's not about common enemies, it's about our 2-page declaration. Take a look at it. It says 3 areas. One section's on free speech, the other is on secular governance, and the other is on national security. And we lay out 12 or 13 principles that say we are against blasphemy laws, against apostasy laws, we're for the equality of men and women, the equality of all individuals under law, the freedom to decide your own path to God. We believe Muslims don't have a monopoly on heaven. We reject violent jihad. Things that are considered blasphemy and heresy in probably most of the Muslim countries, and yet we believe are the values. So when you look at our allies, your allies in America should be those who share our values, period. If they don't share our values, and especially probably the best barometer is not necessarily our own constitution, since people may disagree in other countries about certain elements of our own, but how about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? There's a reason the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, 56 countries, signed the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights and not the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And, you know, I think Eleanor Roosevelt would be rolling over in her grave if she knew what the UN was actually doing and what it was sponsoring. And now we know in Syria, for example, charity groups were actually run by the Assad regime. It's just the UN is a farce. We need to reassemble countries that share our values and start from new, because that's the coalition that should be fighting ISIS. If the Saudis want to fight ISIS, let them, but we shouldn't do them together, because at the end of the day, that's going to give an illusion that somehow they share our values when in fact they don't. And because at the end of the day, in their countries, they don't have the free speech that we Muslims have in America here to have these debates that we need to have. And some people say, well, you know, Zuhdi, have you had death threats? And, you know, listen, the risks that I take pale in comparison to what Muslims in Syria and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere do every day in fighting this. So this is the least we should be doing. And especially, you know, so many Muslims complain that, oh my gosh, I left that stuff and it came here and followed me here in 9/11. I mean, please give us a break. The West went through a Reformation and Enlightenment in which millions died, hundreds of thousands died in that Reformation to give us a society, after many revolutions, not only in Europe but the American Revolution, to give us a society that defeated theocracy. The least thing that Muslims can do is to go through that same thing. And I think we have an opportunity here, sitting in the lap of freedom, to demand that type of reform. So, the 3 points. History. Islam is in that time in history. There are a lot of books out there. Bob's book, Bernard Lewis's book on what went wrong, the crisis in Islam. A lot of these books talk about how the arc in Islam initially, if Islam's recipe was bad, I think from the beginning it would have been a war-based faith. And there was hundreds of years. Now call this an apologetic, call it what you will, but the bottom line is I think your allies are going to be Muslims that, whether it's mythology or whatever it is, it's Muslims that believe that we can get our faith of Islam to believe passionately in countries like America and our Constitution. And I have a podcast on Blaze Radio Network that's called Reform This. And this week I talk about how embarrassing to me it was to see the Secretary of Homeland Security go to the Islamic Society of North America this week and give a speech comparing the plight of Muslims in America to the plight of the African American community in America, and the Civil War and the Jim Crow laws and other things. And it is just absurd. It is this bigotry of low expectations that somehow this group that he's speaking to, which I can tell you, in my book I talk about how in 1995 I went to one meeting at ISNA, and that meeting I showed up. It was after the Islamic Medical Association, which me and the chairman of endocrinology from Bethesda Naval Hospital at the time, who was also Muslim, and went to present a paper there. And the Islamic Society of North America, then the keynote speaker was Siraj Wahaj, who's now still on the board of CARE and has other things. Through his speech, he holds up a Quran and says, we as Muslims have an obligation to make this the Constitution of the United States of America. And he said, this country is suffering the cancers that it does because it doesn't use this holy book as its constitution. And he talked about Bill Clinton and its support for abortion and other things. And I talk in my book about how lightheaded I got and how ill. I was in uniform, and they had mics in the aisles. There were about 20,000 people there. I went to one of the mics, and they had a time for people to announce gatherings they had like you would at any large convention. And I got to a mic and I said, listen, I don't know most of you. This is the first time I've come to an ISNA meeting, but the bottom line is I'm here to publicly disavow any association with this organization. I should have learned when I spent 6 months with the Muslim Student Association in college and then realized what political Islam was, but I thought I'd come and listen. And I said, what your keynote speaker just did was I would consider sedition. You can disagree with policy, But talking about wholesale change of the Constitution is an insurgency and it's sedition. And my wife, who I didn't know at the time was going to be my wife, but I met her 4 years later, and her dad was there, and he looks at me and says, you look familiar. And then we figured out that was when we had met, was as I was exiting stage left at the Islamic Society of North America. But the sad thing is that at that time, now those conventions are 50,000 people, not 20,000. Secretary of Homeland Security is speaking to them, catering to their victimology, rather than telling them that they need to step up and reform the ideas that are causing, that they are part of the root cause problem, which I believe they are the first 3 or 4 steps of radicalization, which is victimization, a sense of alienation against the West, the division of America and the world into the land of Islam, Dar al-Islam, and Dar al-Harb. None of these ideas have been reformed by the Islamic Society of North America. They still hand out The Reliance of the Traveler as a book to their, which is a Sharia book that calls for all of the things you see in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. One of the projects at our organization in reform is 6 months ago, the Parliament of World Religions, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, is this sort of the Olympics of interfaith activity globally. So the Parliament meets in Utah this year in America. And guess who's the chairman of their board, of the Parliament of World Religions? Is Imam Mujahid from Chicago, from Sound Vision. What is Sound Vision? It is a Saudi operation that is funded not significantly, but a lot of their money comes from Saudis, of distributing a propaganda operation for distributing Saudi literature in the West. And they sponsor many. Now they have billboards that now recently local media in Phoenix asked me about, which say on the billboard it says, ISIS, you suck, you are not Muslim, or something like that. And people see this and say, wow, this is very moderate. Who are these people? And it says sponsored by Sound Vision and et cetera. And then we say, well, listen, wait a minute. The Saudis hate ISIS too. This might look moderate, but you have to look who these groups are. So we took a press release to the Parliament. Our Courtney Lonergan, who's our community outreach director at the American Islamic Forum, went to the Parliament, and the keynote speaker was the Sharia court head from Mecca, was the keynote speaker at the Parliament of World Religions. She was supposed to sit at the table, and they ended up moving her chair and pretending that she wasn't supposed to be sitting at that table. She then handed him our press release calling for condemning the Parliament for inviting a group that really disavows all of the principles of the Parliament, and yet is participating as so-called interfaith activity. And it's just mind-boggling, the contradictions that you see happen, and then you wonder why we don't have a blueprint for victory. So when it comes to free speech, I think, if we learn anything, even in America, we have blasphemy laws. How can we reform our faith to these ideas if we can't even talk about them? If we have people giving keynote addresses that are apologists for misogyny, honor violence, honor abuse against women, and the litany of laws done in the name of Islam go on, and yet we can't even talk about it because that's interesting. In the elections, we talk about establishment and we want the non-establishment candidates. As a Muslim, I'm looking for the folks that are against the establishment globally, right? Not only domestically, but globally. Because that's what's killing us, is the establishment globally that is what I call petro-Islam has destroyed our faith. And it will continue to destroy it over and over like Groundhog Day until there are regime changes there. So free speech is not going to happen without democratization. The patients might get sicker before they get better. So Egypt got sicker, but it was on its way to getting better and now has gone back to a dictatorship. And one of the examples I was going to tell you about is about a lady who had been imprisoned in Egypt. Why? Because she questioned the sacrifice that was done to lambs and animals for Eid al-Adha, which is going to be, actually it's interesting, it was supposed to be Sunday, 9/11, and the Saudis said it was 9/12 this year. And I don't believe in conspiracy theories, but I don't think it's a coincidence that they sort of decided, well, maybe this lunar month will be one day longer because we don't want to have it land on 9/11, which was technically where we thought it was going to be. But the holiday this year, our biggest holiday of the year, is on Monday. And this lady, El-Sisi, put in prison because of her postings against the ritual sacrifice that was done. So to think that somehow these dictators that might say the right things, talk about reform. Yes, El-Sisi said the right thing to Al-Azhar, but he hasn't followed it with action. He hasn't followed it with liberalization. He hasn't followed it with magazines and newspapers that allow free speech and debate in the public in Cairo and elsewhere. Their societies are not changing. They're still cauldrons of radicalization, but he told them to stop the violence, to stop the ISISes of the world, but he never used words like freedom and democracy. So I don't care what a dictator says. He might say the right things of what he wants to end in that vacuum, but unless they use terms like freedom and democracy and debate and critical thinking and reason, those terms, unless they use those terms, it's a facade. Ezra Nomani, who's one of the leaders in our reform movement, has talked about the honor brigade. So that's part of the establishment, is that there's so many groups out there that are trying to preserve the honor of Islam, the honor of leaders who don't want you to start to critically think about what's happening within the Islamic leadership. So ISIS is working despite all the things we're doing because their means is disruption. And I think the blueprint for victory is disruption. We need to disrupt the establishment, disrupt the regimes, and yes, still work to make sure the really bad guys, the militants, don't get their hands on nuclear weapons, don't get their hands on things that can really be used in a fashion to short-circuit the long-term plan. But we need a long-term vision. We need a liberty doctrine. And I still haven't heard from any candidates that remain what their doctrine would be. And unfortunately, we need a bigger doctrine in that blueprint. Our Muslim Reform Movement provides a 2-page menu for that, if you will, and it can be used to vet. My last podcast, I did a mock interview with Abdul, who's supposed to be a sort of a fake refugee, and what are some of the questions you would ask him? Because they say, oh, well, they can lie in it. If you write the questions right, and as many of you who may have done intelligence or other things, there are ways to interview folks. The Israelis are great at this. There are ways to interview them for half an hour, and figure out exactly whether they're lying or not. The pieces of the puzzle have to fit together. So ask him questions like, should the government make laws to protect the image of Muhammad? Should the government make laws to prevent things said at sermons, or to protect Jesus' image? So you can find ways to find out what their beliefs are on blasphemy laws or on women's rights by not asking them directly. So at the end of the day, I think, as Voltaire said, I might disagree with what you say, but I will fight and defend to the death your right to say it. Or at least his biographer said that that's what he said. And, I do believe that you need to find Muslims that will fight to the death your right to disagree with Islam, to criticize Muhammad, and all of these aspects of what are the core nature of our faith that need reform. And I think ultimately we need to find new leadership. We're not going to be able to fill convention halls with 10,000, 20,000 Muslims because the secular community has not organized. But even having said that, ISNA, the last poll said they have 3 to 4% of Muslims that identify with ISNA, 7% with CARE. So that leaves 90-some% of Muslims in America that don't identify with any Islamic organization. But that's going to take a campaign, it's going to take a change in culture, it's going to take Hollywood and media and mainstream media to begin to acknowledge. I mean, once we start getting sports figures, the Kim Kardashians of the world and others who might not understand any of this, but to begin in pop culture to work with the right Muslims versus the problematic ones, you'll start to see massive changes, I think, in what people believe. Thanks for your time, and I'd love to take your questions.
Dr. Jasser, how large a contingent of imams and clerics are there, would you say, in this country who are working with you for reform, openly or covertly?
I wish I could give you an answer of a large number, but right now, if you ask me what my business plan is, our business plan is to, in the next 5 to 10 years, is to get the business community behind what we're doing. We have a few imams that are reformists that are out there that are working with us, but just to give you a little sense of what the right answer to your question is, in February and in March and April, we mailed out 5,000 mailers to 3,000 mosques and then 2,000 celebrity-type, publicly known Muslims that we identified as leading voices in the Muslim community nationally. We got about a quarter of those back because of the addresses or whatever. We then resent them out in May and June, and now over the last 6 weeks to 8 weeks, I've had 2 interns calling and doing the sort of the investigative journalism thing. And what we did is we have a 1-page letter. It says, "We are the Muslim Reform Movement. Here's the 15 names of us. Here's our declaration. We ask you to look at it. Please do one of 2 things. Either sign it and join us, and we'll add your name to our ongoing list, and our website hopefully will be done in the next month or so to list these folks, or send us a reason why you refuse to participate." We had one imam that participated with us in the conference I told you about that then went back, and his board nearly fired him. They then sent us a letter explaining why he was misguided in joining us, and I felt sorry for the guy in one way, but on the other hand was a little upset that he had abandoned our project, but he had received a lot of pressure, and he's from Canada. But the rest are still on board of the 15 that started this. We have gotten a couple phone calls of folks that said, "Do not ever call our mosque again. If you call, we will come out there." I have one of the voicemails I have recorded, and we posted it on YouTube, that says, "We will come out and tell you personally if you keep calling us to sign your declaration." There was a couple interviews nationally where media have taken our declaration and taken it to mosques. We pasted it on the mosque, the Saudi mosque here. We walked, and after our meeting and conference, 7 or 8 of us walked to the mosque and did the Martin Luther thing and taped it on their door. And some media paid attention to that. But the bottom line is 95% or so have been silent. The others have been rejections. And so we're still, and the bottom line is I think, there was an imam in North Dakota that we have a clip of, that the local anchor had our declaration, and the imam didn't know he was going to be asked about it, and he went through the declaration, and the imam said, and he realized it was like a local, I think it was Fargo or one of the cities in North Dakota. He ended up agreeing with all of it. So tacitly, he ended up agreeing because he realized he had to. So to me, that's a great example of how when you publicly do these things, you can pressure them into saying the right, or at least taking the right stance. Even if they don't believe it or not, bottom line is at least they're publicly held accountable. Then if they reverse it publicly later, you can show that they're lying and they're doing the dissimulation thing. But I wish I could tell you we've had a great response. We have not. And some may say, and I bet you if you ask these organizations, they say, "Oh, we didn't get the letter," or whatever. After Orlando, within 4 days, these organizations posted 300 imams that signed a letter, an Orlando statement after the shooting in Orlando. There's a website called lettertobaghdadi.com, signed by 500 mosques in Europe and America, with basically it's a who's who list of Muslim Brotherhood leaders in the West. And right now we're almost done preparing a position paper against that letter to Baghdadi, because if you want a definition of the difference between what I've been telling you and what the Islamist apologists that are anti-terror, that are part of the CVE movement would tell you, it's that letter. The letter says, for example, ISIS doesn't know what they're doing, they're anti-woman, but the word equality is not used in their page on women. On jihad, it says Baghdadi is not qualified to declare jihad. There are certain ways to declare jihad. You have to do X, Y, and Z. So they basically still agree with the ends, but not the means. And on and on. It's basically an apologetic for an Islamic State instead of against. And I think that's the fact that they got all those people to sign this very intricate theological document against Baghdadi shows you, A, they know they have a problem, but B, they can gather and sign signatures when they want to. So they've been ignoring. I will tell you that one of the problems we have, who do I go to? The 70-80% of Muslims that agree with us aren't organized. They don't have, if I Google them, they're not going to show up with organizations called Islamic. You know, they're going to be very hard to find, and that's our problem, and that's why we need your help.
Studies have shown that most Americans who are Muslim don't attend mosque and are relatively secularized. They're also a very successful group in America as a whole. They have more graduate degrees, they have more professional degrees, higher household income than the national average. So, is it possible to encourage within the professions or with businesses secular or reform Muslim organizations to counter the professional groups associated with the Muslim Brotherhood that are also in America, like Muslim Advocates, for example, or the Association of Muslim Social Scientists?
That's a great question, and that's why when people say, well, Zuhdi, you're not an imam, you're not, I will tell you the solution, and I think if you look at Christian Reformation and what happened in the West, I don't think the initial seeds were done by the clerics, by the priests. I think it was done by the business community. Now, I might be wrong, but the bottom line is the revolutions against theocrats were done by the affluent, the community that did not want the men in robes controlling their governments. And, you know, I was talking on national TV a couple weeks ago. There was a report that the British Home Secretary came out with that blamed all of the radicalization on the internet. Blamed it on YouTube, social media companies, basically. And they came out with this 10-page report saying social media needs to do a better job of stopping the portals that are radicalizing Muslims, etc. Now, I'll give them some credit. There is some problem there in that you could be anti-Israel and all this other hate stuff get put on. Nobody says anything. And yet, when it comes to Islam, nobody, you know, I'm sorry, they say everything about being anti-Israel or anti, you know, the things that bother us as conservatives, if you will, but then the Islamists are given a pass, and the radicalized websites are given a pass. So there is some problem there, but I think we need to engage the business community, be it Google Ideas. You see all of these projects happening in social media or elsewhere that are devoid of this lens of looking through it through advocating liberty. The Islamists, through petro-Islam, evangelized political Islam. I would tell you, just as in the Cold War, we didn't only counter Soviet war theory, but we were evangelically promoting capitalism. We were promoting through Radio Free Europe and other aspects the ideas that we believed in. And right now we have somehow gotten into our DNA that we need to apologize for American ideas. That somehow everything that bad happens, if we try to help groups in Syria or even Libya, not to upset some of you, but even Libya somehow that, well, Gaddafi must have been better because if we did something. Now, I'm not saying that this is an apologetic for what Hillary did because she was working with Islamists very often. But the bottom line is if you're against dictatorship, it doesn't mean that if you try to work with some groups that you might, you know, get some arms into the wrong groups or some ideas or money into institutes that might end up not being the best. But at the end of the day, the majority, if they agree with your values, is a better movement than saying that, well, handing all of our jets and other things to governments like Saudi is somehow better. I don't see how that makes sense. So we need to work, I think, in the grassroots level by putting fire under the feet of Muslims in Northern Virginia, in Arizona, in California, in New York. Every Muslim that you meet in medical groups, bar associations. I mean, it's interesting. A judge was just appointed this week. Why haven't we held, when I went to speak in New York 2 years ago, one of the groups in New York City that tried to have me stop from speaking was the Muslim Bar Association in New York. And I was trying to figure out where they came, what work they came out of, and I was wondering where the Muslim lawyers and judges were that agreed with me. And there are many. I've spoken to law schools before where many law students get it because they're going into study American law, but they don't want to take on this mantle because of how they get targeted by other Muslims in our community. And I think we need to empower them, protect them. I can tell you many stories of Muslim women that go to Homeland Security or universities and say, I've been attacked and condemned by an imam. I tried to express violence, domestic abuse, and they ignore me. And our Homeland Security, our academia and professors ignore them also. So we have to develop institutes that protect them and institutions that will defend their free speech.